Good morning. I'm Matt Reardon, and I'm filling in for Eric Snodgrass today. He is out traveling. To start, this picture that we're looking at, this is a University of Madison satellite product that they put out, and it's just showing all the smoke that is really socked in across the eastern Corn Belt. That is the sun rising this morning. You can see that kind of diagonal line coming down out of the northeast. There's the sunrise exposing all the smoke. Now, there are some clouds on the far west side of this image. We'll talk about some of those, the storms overnight. But certainly the big story, if you've been across the eastern Corn Belt, parts of southern Wisconsin, certainly Michigan, parts of far eastern Iowa, Indiana, just one of the worst days, I think, yesterday of smoke. I'll just say I've lived in Illinois my whole life, about 30 years now. Never experienced this thick of smoke across the state. I'll take you back as of yesterday morning. There's the satellite imagery from Tuesday morning. You can see all that smoke coming down out of the Great Lakes area, all the way into parts of eastern Iowa, even far northeast Missouri, from the Canadian wildfires that we've really been tracking for the last 30 to 40 days at least. We've had some smoky, hazy days in the Midwest, but not quite one, I think, like this. I drove yesterday, I spoke at an event in the Quad Cities. I drove down I-74 towards Champaign yesterday evening, and it smelled like a campfire. It was like I was camping, going through some of the smoke. And unfortunately, this has impacts to health. It's an air quality issue. And if we look at those air quality indices here this morning, it does not paint a good picture across the Midwest. Big cities like Chicago, down through the I-57 corridor towards Champaign, over east into Indianapolis, up into Detroit, really the whole eastern Corn Belt. Any area in here that kind of red shading or above is what we would consider unhealthy. And then when you get into that purple and even values exceeding that, really you do not want to be spending a ton of time outside today. So maybe cancel any biking trips or exercise that you had planned if you can. It's just, I'll even say it's getting frustrating, right? Because we've been dealing with developing drought, and on top of this, right, you look up and the sky is shrouded and the sun is not bright. It's like this orange globe coming up in my window right now. And it would be nice to move some of this out of here and replace it with rain. And I think there's some hints of that in the forecast, so let's get toward that. If we look yesterday just at the severe weather reports across the U.S., not the most active day, certainly compared to some of the ones we've had just recently here this week. But there were some pretty potent reports, and I'll zoom this in a little bit to give you a better look. We had a severe thunderstorm complex move through parts of the Texas Panhandle quickly into Oklahoma and then Kansas. Not a ton of wind reports associated with this event, but the ones that were recorded were quite potent. 80 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour in some cases. And then we had a few recordings in Kansas, if you can see just here in southwest Kansas, of 100 mile an hour thunderstorm wind gusts. And when you get up to that level, we're talking about some pretty significant damage. So this was a powerful storm system. A few scattered reports beyond that, just toward the east over by Pennsylvania. We had some wind reports with the low pressure system spinning up there, firing off a few storms toward the north of that overnight in Nebraska and South Dakota, with some of these storms now exiting toward the east into Iowa. We'll talk about that in just a bit here. I want to take you back. This is looking at the radar imagery valid as of yesterday evening. I just wanted to give you a look at that storm complex that moved through Oklahoma, then into Kansas, really back across the Kansas-Oklahoma border, quickly racing off into the east, into Arkansas before weakening. And outside of being in a pretty impressive storm complex here, I think there's a hint at what's going on in the broader pattern. We can see the storm complex really riding over that Texas ridge that's been producing all the excess heat down there. And you can see it starts out with that southwest to northeast motion, goes over the top of that ridge, and then it's now coming back down through Oklahoma. And that really just tells us that ridge centered somewhere here over North Texas and southern Oklahoma, as that ridge riding storm rides just around the top of that. If I jump you over, take a look at the jet stream map here, you can see that ridge really centered over Texas. I mean, this has been the case for a few days now, where we have these ridge riding thunderstorms going over the top of it here. We just saw that fast moving complex go through Oklahoma. And I'll quickly take this through just the next few days here. And I think this is going to impact the forecast. We see that ridge shifting toward the east a little bit. The troughing that was over the west now shifting more toward the Four Corners area, almost all the way over to the Continental Divide. This is getting into Thursday evening here. We'll talk about the implications in the forecast just a bit, but I want to give you an update on where that ridge is located in Texas. There's the ridge. I mean, you can see it in just looking at the last 24 hours of precipitation. North of that, we've had some storms through the Great Plains, South Dakota, Nebraska. Those are exiting off toward the east here as we wake up this morning. That trough and low pressure system out in the Pacific Northwest producing some scattered storms, and then the low pressure system that caused the severe weather earlier this week now exiting off into the northeast, producing some rain there. Taking a look at the satellite imagery this morning for the whole country, similar to the product that we started this video with, we can see that smoke. I mean, that's the big story here across the eastern Corn Belt, the air quality indices we just covered. But here's some of those overnight storms. They are now exiting into eastern Iowa. There's some rain falling here, fortunately, getting into the Quad Cities here. It remains to be seen, if these will be weakened as they move into Illinois. That would be my guess. We even have some storms kind of backbuilding here in far southwestern Iowa. I would expect both these complexes to weaken some here this morning, but we are expecting some additional development at some point today in this area, either in northern Illinois, far western Illinois, kind of getting into Missouri, perhaps even eastern Iowa. So we'll keep an eye on that. We also have a low pressure system, at least a weak one, spinning up into Minnesota here, and we're expecting some severe storms to fire along that, albeit not too strong, hopefully. Here's looking at that same map here, but looking at the radar coverage, again, just kind of these scattered weekend storms. They fired overnight and yesterday evening along the Great Plains, along that ridge, now pushing off into eastern Iowa. We have some here on the Iowa-Nebraska border. Not the strongest looking storms here this morning, but they are producing rainfall. In fact, if I jump back and look at the last 24 hours of Precip, see some of these values approaching above a half inch. When we're in a drought, getting a little bit desperate in some of these areas, I think just about all of us would take a half inch on some of the acreage here. I mentioned that ridge we talked about over Texas would be meandering, and we'll also have some developments out west I want to talk about. This is looking at a similar view of that ridge, and if I take this through today on Wednesday into Thursday, it didn't look like a huge change here, but we're already seeing something of a shift. That ridge, which was centered really over Texas, we watched that storm complex right up and over Oklahoma, now shifting, I would say centered more toward the southern Mississippi Valley. That's going to have some implications on the forecast. That trough that was situated really right over the western region has shifted further to the east as well. Immediately, this will do two things to temperatures as we go through the day on Thursday and then into Friday. Expecting warmer temperatures to build into this corridor here. The Mississippi Valley still quite warm in Texas, and then finally bringing warmth into California. You can even see a weak ridge here developing in California and Oregon. If you remember, California this year has been anything but warm. They've had atmospheric river vents earlier in the year that kept temperatures down, a lot of rainfall, a lot of snow, and then even just in the recent past, as a result of some of the cool waters we think here off the southwest coastline, they've been very cold in California. So something of a pattern shift here, finally getting warmer temperatures into California after what was a cold start to 2023. If we look at the all hazards map from NOAA this morning, I think this is really reflecting the shift in that ridge that we just saw. First one, we just talked about maybe the Central Valley of California getting heat, excessive heat watches now issued by the National Weather Service along the western coast of the U.S. Southern Mississippi Valley, excessive heat warnings now out for many areas here, virtually the entire state of Mississippi here. Watches even beyond that, getting into southern Illinois and parts of Missouri as that ridge inches toward the east. Now, if you remember, we did talk about ridge riding thunderstorms. Those tend to fire along the periphery of that ridge. So we would expect if this ridge is moving east, some of that activity that we saw maybe focused between northern Oklahoma and South Dakota is likely going to shift toward the east, and that has big implications for the Corn Belt drought. First thing I want to cover, temperatures, maximum temperatures really over the next 3 days. This from the National Weather Service, their NDFD product. Here's Wednesday, so that ridge still really centered over Texas and Oklahoma, still seeing cooler than average temperatures out along the west coast. But I take this 24 hours ahead, and there's that shift, that trough over the western coast, moving more over the Four Corners region, now impacting more Wyoming in terms of those high temperature anomalies. California moving into the warm side, Oregon as well, and then Missouri, parts of western Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, or Mississippi, I should say, getting into those higher temperatures now on Thursday. On Friday, those shifting even further toward the east, perhaps becoming more potent in states like Missouri. I will say, getting 100-degree temperatures into the Corn Belt proper. I saw a 100-degree temperature reading in southern Illinois recently. It's hard to do that now in June and July with a corn crop transpiring as much as it does along the Corn Belt and the soybean belt. But unfortunately, in these years where we have drought, there's not as much moisture, right, being transpirated by the crop in June and July, and it unfortunately makes it easier to get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit without as much moisture. The ground can heat up quicker and heat the air faster as a result. So we could see temperatures getting into 100, which has become something of a rarity with the crop that we're producing here in the Corn Belt. But we can see those high temperatures moving in to the West Coast as well. If we take this all the way out into Saturday, into Sunday, the temperatures moderate a bit. So fortunately not expecting a long-lasting heat wave here across the Mississippi River Valley, but it is something of a shift, and I think perhaps has even more relevance when we look at the precipitation maps going forward. Today, the Storm Prediction Center, I'll move this back just a bit here to get the national view. That low pressure system exiting up into Minnesota, expecting some organization here along a weak frontal boundary moving toward the east. Western Wisconsin, really kind of the main bullseye for that. Again, not expecting what we consider high-end severe weather here, but enough for the storm prediction to put out a slight risk. A marginal risk. This is really their lowest category of risk, all the way through Illinois into parts of western Indiana. I mentioned we had some of these weaker storms moving through Iowa. We had another patch of them just coming out of the Iowa-Nebraska border. I would expect at some point today, and some of the models are hinting at redevelopment of storms, and I'll just draw it here, in some sort of corridor along the I-74, maybe I-80 corridor in here. It remains to be seen exactly where. Some of these could be a bit stronger. Again, not strong enough that the Storm Prediction Center is highlighting any sort of increased risk, but I mentioned it really, again, for rainfall. I'm expecting some corridor in here to get a bit of rainfall here today. It could come later, maybe than we expect overnight tonight, Wednesday, even into early Thursday morning. But expecting some folks in here to get a good shot of rain, perhaps an inch or more. We'll keep a close eye on that. As we go through the day on Thursday, Storm Prediction Center highlighting a more organized area, really from the Missouri-Iowa border all the way into Indianapolis, up through Chicago. Expecting overnight storms to, again, go up at some point tonight. That will likely leave some sort of lingering rain-cooled outflow boundary. That could become a focus for storms going through the day on Thursday. And there's some impressive instability values building into Illinois on Thursday in some of these forecasts. It has been a while since we've been talking about dew points in Illinois or Indiana above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I just talked about how the air's been drier. That allows us to heat up toward that 100 degree Fahrenheit level easier. But without as much dew point, we don't have the same instability that we'd have in a typical year. So while I'm not rooting for severe weather by any means, getting some instability, some real moisture back into the Corn Belt, I think would be beneficial for getting more significant rainfall rather than arguing over whether we got 0.2 of an inch or half an inch. We might be debating, whether we got 1 inch or 1.5. So that would be a nice change of pace. If we go into day 3, we see some of this activity shift off toward the east, and really just looking, at the Storm Prediction Center map, you can notice the shift. Today and yesterday, we were talking about storms firing along that ridge here in Oklahoma, up through South Dakota. And now that ridge, as it shifts off toward the east, somewhere located maybe over Arkansas and Louisiana, we've shifted that corridor of focused thunderstorm activity, now over Illinois, into the eastern Corn Belt, Ohio. Now, around that ridge, more toward the backside, we do have some continued severe weather we might have to look at in terms of Nebraska and Kansas, but just a nice highlight there of where that ridge is shifting, with potential storms developing all the way back around it into parts of the south. Now, I wanted to give you a look at some of the high-resolution models. These are the weather models that actually resolve those individual thunderstorm complexes. The GFS, the European model, they're fantastic, but they have poor resolution. They're not going to be able to determine those storm scale processes that can really determine who got 1.5 inches of rainfall and who missed out, depending on which county is affected. This is just one of them. This is the 3-kilometer high-res NAM forecast out of NOAA. I'll take this through this morning. This is valid really as of 7 a.m. here Wednesday morning. And if I play this through, there's that low pressure system spinning up in Minnesota. A focus for storm activity this evening in Wisconsin. But you notice, not a lot of activity really through the diurnal peak today. I just took this through really the early afternoon here on Wednesday afternoon. Not much activity here in northern Illinois associated with what was perhaps some weakening storms over Iowa. The high-res NAM, this came out a few hours ago, not really picking up those storms in eastern Iowa that have been weakening anyway. That leads me to believe maybe we should discount this model a bit if it can't even get the beginning of that forecast right. But nonetheless, I want to take you through this one quickly because it does show overnight, early Thursday morning, a large complex of storms moving through western Illinois, moving through southern Illinois, parts of far eastern Missouri. This area has been very dry. So that's something to keep an eye on. If I take a look at another one of these models, we look at the high resolution, rapid refresh. If I take this down to the 60 model run, that goes quite a bit further out. You'll notice that complex fires here tonight went later Wednesday evening around Chicago, moves through parts of central Indiana. So we've shifted that storm complex, 100 or 200 miles to the east. That's a big difference in terms of who's getting the most of this precip overnight tonight. Now, that was the 6Z run. That came out a few hours ago. If I take this up to 10Z, this run here doesn't go out as far. The one's in between those 6 hours. But it came out more recently. That leads us to believe maybe it'll be a little bit more accurate in terms of where it's initiating those storms. And in fact, it's capturing now those weakening storms in eastern Iowa. It's capturing even that patch of storms, or at least that light rain moving through parts of western Iowa and eastern Nebraska. That leads me to believe this model here, at least this run, might have a better grasp of the pattern here going forward, at least through the next 24 hours. Now, this model here only goes out the next 18 hours. I mentioned these ones in between the 6 hours don't go out quite as far. But if I play this forward, not a lot of activity through the day today. This is through the early afternoon on Wednesday, and not much even getting into tonight toward midnight. So the storm complexes that do fire today could take some time. Now, that's not to say Wisconsin expecting afternoon storms here today associated with that Storm Prediction Center risk that they have of here. But at some point this evening in this corridor here, Indianapolis to Chicago, Peoria, expecting something to initiate overnight and move through this area and hopefully bring quite a bit of rainfall to some of these counties here. Looking out beyond that in toward the weekend, we have to shift back toward those global models. That is the European model, or the GFS gives us a broader look at some of these precipitation ranges here. I'll take this through the day here on Wednesday from the European model. You'll notice not a lot of activity through the day, but when we get into early Thursday morning, the European model initiating thunderstorms really around Peoria, racing those through the southeast, really that I-74 corridor I was talking about earlier, Champaign, Decatur, some really drought-stricken areas here in central Illinois could get some significant precip. Again, I just showed you 3 models. One of them had the storms more through western Illinois, this one now through central Illinois, and we saw one of the models here pushing storms really through central Indiana along that I-65 corridor. So big differences here overnight, I think, determining who might get the most precipitation out of this. The good news is that as that ridge kind of sits over the Mississippi River Valley, we'll have multiple chances for storms in this area. If I take this through early Friday morning, you'll notice Thursday night, more storms potentially firing along the Missouri-Iowa border. We have storms even back into Nebraska and South Dakota to keep an eye on, and then further toward the east as we go through the day on Friday, perhaps into the eastern Corn Belt, with that area highlighted by the Storm Prediction Center kind of right in through here along the Ohio River Valley. If I play this out through Saturday into Sunday, even more focus along the Ohio River Valley associated with that ridge kind of flattening out in that area, getting into Monday, into Tuesday, when all is said and done. A decent corridor here, potentially 1.5 inches or more, all the way from parts of western Nebraska through Illinois into the eastern Corn Belt, the focus really being the Ohio River Valley, and then some of these storms making their way, coming around the ridge into parts of the Mid-South, and then into the Southeast proper here. When all is said and done, here is the week 1 anomalies from the ECMWF. Now, this came out in the 0Z, so this model run's getting a little stale here. We'll get the updates from the 6Z and then the 12Z here today. Curious what the agreement is there, but at least for now, again, highlighting that corridor we just talked about, and through here, still leaving some areas dry. We've kind of been seeing this pop up here in the early July forecast, some sort of dry patch here in parts of northern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and Minnesota, keeping an eye on that. And then even some dryness down here, southern Louisiana. As much as the south has got quite a bit of precipitation this year, maybe in this corridor, parts of southern Louisiana dealing with some lingering dryness. We're keeping an eye on that as well. Just to get another opinion, we'll take a look at the GFS. It has been a bit wetter. I mean, we can just see that if I shift from the week 1 anomalies from the ECMWF as far as those precip anomalies, and then toward the GFS, quite a wider corridor of significant precip here, all the way covering the whole state of Illinois and Indiana, more of Iowa, making that dry patch in Wisconsin, Minnesota quite a bit smaller. Now, we think, certainly over the last 15 to 20 days, the ECMWF, the European model, has had a better handle on some of these precipitation patterns. But I don't think it's bad news that the GFS is trending a little bit wetter, all else equal. It is something to keep an eye on as we go forward here. I will say the European model actually had a model update yesterday. They doubled their number of ensemble members. That's fantastic. We get a lot of use and utility out of those ensembles, getting kind of a wider picture of all those forecast scenarios that could happen with some resolution improvements as well. So potentially the European model getting a little bit more accurate here just yesterday in comparison to the GFS. I wouldn't say, this model run here is definitely more accurate, but something to keep an eye on as we look at that pattern going through early July here. Now, something we've talked about quite a bit recently is the position of the subtropical jet stream. It's something we focused on in June, kind of explaining where this drought came from. And as I take you through the forecast here, this is looking at a global view of all the jet stream level winds across the Earth. Just kind of orient you here. Here's the United States. I'll draw the outline here. Here's kind of the discombobulated subtropical jet stream that's been lifting back up into the United States, helping to bring some of our rain chances back. And I want to show you this forecast just to get an idea, at least from the ECMWF ensemble, that just doubled the number of ensemble members yesterday. As I play this through early July, this is getting into July 2nd, out into Tuesday of next week, into Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Now, this is getting quite far out into the forecast, but we see a better development. I'll flip back to the view that I just had before. We see a better development, or a better connection, if you will, from Hawaii. Here's this little black speck out here in the Pacific is Hawaii, of that jet stream all the way up from Hawaii, that moisture connection from the Pacific in through the western United States into the Corn Belt. Really kind of focused over the northern Corn Belt here as far as the jet stream is concerned. Again, this forecast all the way out into next week. It is from the ECMWF ensembles, but this would produce a lot of momentum through the central part of the country. And momentum is what we were lacking in June. Momentum is what we need to get these periodic storm chances that we've now been enjoying here this weekend in the forecast that I just took you through. Another thing that this could do is you'll notice it coming onshore right through central California. Well, that's not a ridge now in California. If you remember the forecast here over the next 3 days, we're expecting excessive heat to move into parts of California here. This would walk back, at least next week, some of that excessive heat. Keep California, I think, more seasonal, maybe even back toward cooler temperatures right along the coastline associated with the waters there. But at the same time, it would bring more periodic storm chances through the Midwest. And if we jump over and look at the Climate Prediction Center, their precipitation outlook for that 8 to 14 day time window, July 5th through July 11th, getting almost into the second week of July here, you'll notice a bigger corridor of above average precip across the middle of the country. This kind of threshold here was further toward the south earlier, and some of their forecasts lifting up further toward the north, I think in concert with that jet stream forecast coming through parts of the Midwest. Some of these forecasts, even getting out into July, had a continuation of that dry patch here in parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin, but the forecast I just showed you, at least out into Friday, had that jet stream lifting more up through the northern Corn Belt and would potentially keep periodic storm chances moving through that area. Temperatures, we see more normal temperatures return to the west, perhaps slightly above normal temperatures in Washington, but California now back toward normal or even below normal just along the coast here, associated with that jet stream coming right onshore there. Now, this is looking at the ECMWF ensemble precipitation anomalies for the last 7 days in the forecast. This is looking all the way out July 6th through July 13th. This is quite a ways out in the forecast. In fact, some of these wetter, long-term extended forecasts in June belied what was a continuation of the drought. So they were really kind of misleading us in early to mid-June here. So I want to put some skepticism on this map here. The difference, I'll say, between the long-term forecast we were looking at June is they depicted a big pattern shift. Whereas this wetter forecast here from, say, South Dakota through Nebraska, through Missouri, drought-starved Missouri, through virtually the whole state of Illinois and Indiana, is this doesn't totally disagree with what we've seen here just in that recent forecast that we just looked at. I remember, if you remember the forecast here over the next 6 days, we drew this corridor of higher precipitation right in through this area, kind of covering the whole Ohio River Valley and extending off into northern Kansas and Nebraska. So what I'm trying to say here is this is aligning with the current pattern that we have, that we possess now here going through the next 3 days that we're very confident in. And so that lends more confidence to this long-range forecast than we had and looking at those June precipitation anomalies. Now, it's not to say I have 100% confidence. We're not going to have that kind of confidence when we're talking about a 7 to 14 day forecast, but I have more belief in the precipitation anomalies that we're seeing here than I would otherwise, given the consistency with that jet stream pattern. We see this all the time. The pattern as it ends up will not look exactly like this. I mean, there's not going to be this wide swath of, an inch and a half of rainfall through the middle part of the country. There'll be areas where the storms focus on that have more rainfall than not. But nonetheless, I think this is good news for some areas that are really drought-stricken in the central Corn Belt. Wanted to finish up today. The Eastern Pacific has been quite active. If you remember, we have a lot of warm water down here in the far Eastern Pacific as El Nino develops, and that is helping to fuel an early start to the hurricane center, the hurricane season, I should say, the National Hurricane Center, putting out these forecasts here. Tropical Storm Adrian just formed the first one in the Eastern Pacific season, getting the name that starts with A. The next one, I believe, will be Beatrice, potentially forming here over the next 3 to 5 days in the far eastern Pacific. Right now, these aren't a threat to land. We're not thinking exiting out into the Pacific proper. Beatrice will see this as quite a ways out from developing. And while they're not a threat, to the coastline of the United States, if they turn inland into Mexico, they can bring moisture up into the southern United States. If they develop into big, strong hurricanes proper, even here in the eastern Pacific, they can start to shift, adjust, or strengthen our jet stream here over North America. And you'll hear us talk in every video of the position and the strength of that jet stream is going to determine what's going on in that forecast. We'll keep an eye here in the eastern Pacific as things heat up here in early July. That's all I have for you all this morning. Thanks for watching.